The year was 1887, and in the windswept plains of Nebraska Territory, where endless grasslands stretched toward distant horizons and fortunes were built on the backs of longhorn cattle, two identical sisters named Rebecca and Ruth Hamilton were about to discover that sometimes the greatest deceptions come wrapped in the promise of love, and that survival in the American frontier required more than just hope. It demanded the courage to uncover truths that others would kill to keep buried. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late September, carried by the postal rider who made his monthly rounds through the isolated farming communities scattered across the Missouri countryside. Rebecca Hamilton heard the horses' hooves pounding against the packed earth of their narrow lane long before she saw the rider himself, and something in the urgent rhythm of that approach made her stomach tighten with anticipation. She had been hanging laundry behind the small farmhouse that had been her family's home for as long as she could remember, working methodically through the endless pile of washing that seemed to multiply faster than she could clean it. The October wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, reminding her that winter was approaching with its familiar promises of hardship and scarcity. The farmhouse stood like a weathered monument to failed dreams, its unpainted clapboard siding grey with age, and its roof patched in so many places that the original shingles were barely visible beneath layers of makeshift repairs. The single chimney leaned at an angle that suggested the next strong wind might bring it crashing down, and the front porch sagged under the weight of accumulated neglect. Inside the house, Rebecca knew her twin sister Ruth was tending to their bedridden father, whose lung disease had progressed to the point where he could barely speak above a whisper. The consumption had been eating away at his strength for 2 years now, transforming the robust farmer who had once worked from dawn to dusk into a frail shadow who spent his days coughing up blood and apologizing for burdens he couldn't control. Their mother had died the previous winter, succumbing to the same wasting disease that now claimed their father, leaving the 19-year-old twins to manage an increasingly desperate situation with resources that seemed to dwindle daily. The small farm that had once supported a family of 4 now barely produced enough to keep 2 young women and an invalid alive through the harsh Missouri winters. The postal rider dismounted with the careful movements of a man whose body had been shaped by decades of hard travel, and his weathered face carried the expression of someone who had delivered both good news and bad to isolated families throughout the territory. He touched his hat brim in a gesture of courtesy before reaching into his leather satchel. "Miss Rebecca Hamilton?" he asked, although he had been making deliveries to their farm for years and knew perfectly well who she was. The formality was part of his professional routine, a way of acknowledging the importance of official correspondence in communities where mail delivery was the primary connection to the outside world. "Yes, sir," Rebecca replied, wiping her hands on her apron and trying to read the man's expression for clues about what kind of news he might be carrying. In her experience, unexpected letters rarely brought good fortune to people in their circumstances. The envelope he handed her was made of expensive paper, heavier and whiter than anything she had seen in years, and the return address was written in an elegant script that spoke of education and prosperity. The name embossed in the upper left corner read, "Whitman and Associates, Legal Correspondence, Omaha, Nebraska Territory." Rebecca's hands trembled slightly as she accepted the letter, wondering what business a law firm in Nebraska could possibly have with an impoverished farming family in Missouri. She had heard stories about legal notices that brought foreclosure, papers or demands for payment of debts that families couldn't possibly satisfy, and the weight of the expensive envelope felt ominous in her calloused fingers. "Thank you," she managed to say, although her voice came out as barely more than a whisper. The postal rider touched his hat again and remounted his horse, disappearing down the lane with the same urgency that had marked his arrival. Rebecca stood in the farmyard for several minutes, holding the unopened letter and trying to gather the courage to discover what new crisis it might contain. The wind picked up, rattling the loose boards on the barn and sending dried leaves skittering across the packed earth. In the distance, she could see storm clouds gathering on the horizon, promising rain that would turn the unpaved roads into rivers of mud and isolate their farm even further from the outside world. Finally, she walked back to the house, her footsteps echoing hollowly on the warped floorboards of the front porch. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and she found Ruth sitting beside their father's bed, reading aloud from a worn copy of the Bible in the soft voice that had always been able to soothe his coughing fits. Ruth looked up as Rebecca entered, and the identical faces that had confused strangers since childhood reflected the same mixture of curiosity and apprehension. They had developed an almost telepathic ability to sense each other's moods and concerns, and Ruth immediately noticed the expensive envelope in her sister's hands. "What is it?" Ruth asked, carefully marking her place in the Bible, before setting it aside. Their father appeared to be sleeping, although his breathing remained labored and punctuated by the wet, rattling sound that had become increasingly prominent over the past few weeks. "Legal correspondence from Omaha," Rebecca replied, settling into the wooden chair that had become her usual seat during their father's worst spells. "I haven't opened it yet." The two sisters looked at each other across their father's bed, both understanding that whatever the letter contained would likely change their lives in ways they couldn't predict or control. They had learned that unexpected news was rarely good, news for people in their circumstances, and the formal nature of the correspondence suggested something more serious than routine business. Rebecca carefully opened the envelope, unfolding several sheets of paper covered with dense legal text that was difficult to understand. But the covering letter, written in plain English, told a story that seemed too incredible to be real. The law firm was writing on behalf of a client named Samuel Morrison, who owned a large cattle ranch in the Nebraska Panhandle and was seeking to arrange marriages for himself and his younger brother, Daniel Morrison. The brothers had apparently heard about the Hamilton twins through a mutual acquaintance who had described them as intelligent, hard-working young women of good character who might be interested in relocating to Nebraska as mail-order brides. The letter went on to explain that Samuel Morrison was prepared to pay all travel expenses for both sisters, provide them with new clothing and other necessities, and offer marriage contracts that would ensure their financial security for life. The ranch was described as prosperous and well-established, with comfortable living quarters and all the conveniences that modern frontier life could provide. What made the offer even more attractive was the immediate financial compensation being proposed. Each sister would receive $200 upon arrival in Nebraska, with an additional $300 to be paid after the marriage ceremonies were completed. The total amount represented more money than the Hamilton family had seen in the past 5 years. Combined, enough to pay for their father's medical care and secure the farm for the foreseeable future. "This can't be real," Ruth whispered, after Rebecca had finished reading the letter aloud. "People don't just offer to pay strangers that kind of money for marriages to men they've never met." Rebecca examined the paperwork more carefully, noting the official seals and legal language that suggested the documents were genuine. The law firm appeared to be legitimate, and the terms of the proposed arrangement were spelled out in precise detail that indicated serious intent rather than some kind of elaborate hoax. "But why us?" Rebecca wondered aloud. "How would these ranchers even know we exist? We've barely left the county in our entire lives." The answer to that question was contained in a separate sheet of paper that identified their mutual acquaintance as Mrs. Eleanor Carruthers, who had operated a boarding house in Kansas City before moving to Nebraska the previous year. Rebecca remembered Mrs. Carruthers from her brief stint working as a seamstress in Kansas City during the summer before their mother's death, when the family's financial situation had temporarily forced her to seek employment away from the farm. Mrs. Carruthers had been kind to Rebecca during her time in the city, offering motherly advice about navigating the challenges of independent life and expressing concern about the young woman's obviously difficult circumstances. Apparently, she had maintained enough interest in the Hamilton family's welfare to recommend the twins to prospective husbands who were seeking wives with the practical skills and moral character that frontier life demanded. The letter from the law firm requested a response within 2 weeks, along with recent photographs of both sisters and basic information about their backgrounds, education, and domestic capabilities. If the Morrison brothers approved of the applications, transportation would be arranged immediately, with the goal of completing both marriages before the onset of winter weather that could make travel difficult. Rebecca and Ruth spent the rest of the day discussing the proposal in hushed tones, weighing the potential benefits against the obvious risks of traveling hundreds of miles to marry strangers. Their father's condition made it impossible to seek his advice, and they had no other family members or close friends who could offer guidance about such a momentous decision. The practical advantages of accepting the offer were undeniable. The lessee immediate payment would be enough to hire proper medical care for their father and ensure that the farm remained viable through the coming winter. The promise of long-term financial security was equally appealing to young women who had spent their entire lives worrying about money and watching their parents struggle with debt and hardship. But the emotional and personal risks were equally obvious. Marriage to unknown men in an unfamiliar territory meant abandoning everything they had ever known and trusting their futures to people whose character and intentions they could only guess at. Stories of mail-order bride arrangements gone wrong were common enough in frontier communities, and both sisters had heard tales of women who had traveled west only to find themselves trapped in abusive relationships or exploitative situations. As evening approached and their father's breathing became more labored, Rebecca and Ruth made their decision with the practical resignation of people who had learned that survival sometimes required accepting unacceptable risks. The money being offered represented their only realistic chance of saving their father's life and preserving their family's modest legacy. They would write to the law firm the next morning, accepting the Morrison brothers' proposal and beginning the process that would transform them from impoverished farm girls into the wives of prosperous cattle ranchers. The decision felt both inevitable and terrifying, but they had learned that life rarely offered perfect choices to people in desperate circumstances. What neither sister suspected as they composed their acceptance letter by lamplight while their father slept fitfully in the next room was that only one of the marriage contracts was genuine. The other was an elaborate deception designed to provide cover for activities that had nothing to do with matrimony and everything to do with a complex web of fraud, territory disputes, and criminal enterprises that stretched across 3 states. VI. Morrison brothers were indeed cattle ranchers, but their primary source of income came from operations that would have shocked the law-abiding citizens of Nebraska. And the Hamilton twins, in their innocence and desperation, were about to become unwitting participants in a scheme that would test their courage, intelligence, and loyalty in ways they could never have imagined. The letter they sent to Omaha the following morning would set in motion a chain of events that would transform not only their own lives, but the entire balance of power in a region where legal authority was often indistinguishable from armed force. and where survival depended on the ability to distinguish between friend and enemy in a world where such distinctions were rarely clear. As Rebecca sealed the envelope containing their acceptance and handed it to the postal rider for delivery, she felt a mixture of hope and dread that would prove prophetic. Their journey to Nebraska would indeed change everything, but not in the ways they expected, and the choices they would be forced to make would determine not only their own futures, but the fate of everyone whose lives intersected with the dangerous game the Morrison brothers were playing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The response from Whitman and Associates arrived with startling speed. Barely 10 days after Rebecca and Ruth had sent their acceptance letter to Omaha. The efficiency suggested either exceptional postal service or predetermined arrangements that had been waiting only for their agreement to be activated. This time, the package was considerably larger, containing not just correspondence, but also a substantial sum of money for travel expenses, detailed itineraries, and what appeared to be professionally taken photographs of two remarkably handsome men identified as Samuel and Daniel Morrison. Samuel, the elder brother at 32, possessed the rugged good looks of someone who had spent his life working outdoors, with sun-weathered skin and the kind of confident bearing that suggested natural leadership. His dark hair was neatly trimmed in the fashion favored by successful businessmen, and his clothing in the photograph was obviously expensive and well-tailored. Daniel, 28 according to the accompanying documentation, had lighter hair and softer features that suggested a more intellectual temperament, although his broad shoulders and calloused hands visible in the photograph indicated he was no stranger to physical labor. Both men projected an aura of prosperity and respectability that seemed almost too good to be true. The travel arrangements were comprehensive and generous, providing first-class train tickets from Kansas City to North Platte, Nebraska, with connecting transportation to the Morrison Ranch located some 50 miles northwest of the railroad terminus. The sisters would be accompanied by a chaperone, Mrs. Adelaide Fletcher, who was described as a widow of impeccable reputation who frequently assisted with such arrangements. What struck both Rebecca and Ruth as particularly thoughtful was the inclusion of a substantial wardrobe allowance and specific instructions for purchasing appropriate clothing in Kansas City before beginning their westward journey. The Morrison brothers had apparently anticipated that farm girls from Missouri might not possess the kind of garments suitable for the wives of prosperous cattle ranchers. The $200 advance payment for each sister had been included in cash, an amount that represented more money than the Hamilton family had possessed at any single time in living memory. The sight of so much currency spread across their kitchen table created a surreal atmosphere, as if they were living someone else's life rather than their own. Their father's condition had deteriorated noticeably during the 10 days they had waited for a response, and the availability of immediate funds allowed them to summon Dr. Harrison from the county seat for the first professional medical consultation they had been able to afford in months. The physician's diagnosis was both expected and devastating: advanced consumption that would likely prove fatal within weeks unless the patient could be moved to a warmer, drier climate with access to specialized treatment. The irony was cruel and perfect. The opportunity that might save their father's life required them to leave him behind at the moment when he needed them most. Yet the alternative, remaining to watch him die slowly while their own futures disintegrated along with the failing farm, offered no benefits to anyone. Dr. Harrison listened to their dilemma with the compassionate pragmatism of a man who had spent decades helping frontier families navigate impossible choices. His recommendation was characteristically direct: hire Mrs. Martha Henley, a widow from town who had experience caring for invalids. Use the Morrison money to ensure their father received proper treatment and pursue the opportunities that would allow them to build stable lives. Your father would never forgive himself if his illness prevented you from escaping the poverty that's trapped this family for generations, the doctor observed. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is trust that your sacrifice will enable those you care about to find better circumstances. The week that followed passed in a blur of preparation and emotional turmoil. Rebecca and Ruth took turns traveling to Kansas City to purchase the clothing and accessories that would transform them from farm girls into the wives of successful ranchers. The shopping expedition was simultaneously exciting and overwhelming, as neither sister had ever owned garments made from fine fabrics or experienced the luxury of choosing from multiple options. The seamstress who fitted them for their traveling dresses was a middle-aged German immigrant named Mrs. Steinberg, who possessed both exceptional skill and the kind of maternal warmth that made the entire process feel less artificial. She listened to their story with understanding nods and offered practical advice about the challenges of adapting to life in unfamiliar territory. Men who send for wives from distant places are usually good providers but poor companions, Mrs. Steinberg observed while pinning Rebecca's hem. They understand business better than emotions, and they expect their households to function like their other enterprises. Learn to manage the domestic sphere with the same efficiency they bring to ranching, and you'll find your place in their world. The advice proved more prescient than either sister realized at the time, although its full significance would only become apparent after they reached Nebraska and began to understand the true nature of the Morrison brothers' operations. Their departure from the farm was scheduled for a crisp morning in early November, when the last of the autumn leaves had fallen and the first frost had killed what remained of their struggling garden. Rebecca and Ruth spent their final evening at home, sitting beside their father's bed, reading to him from the letters they had received from Nebraska and trying to maintain an atmosphere of optimism about their future correspondence. Their father, despite his weakened condition, managed to offer them the kind of practical wisdom that had sustained the Hamilton family through previous crises. His voice was barely audible, but his words carried the weight of hard-earned experience. "Trust your instincts about people," he whispered, his hand moving weakly to grasp Rebecca's fingers. "Prosperity can't hide a cruel nature for long, and kindness doesn't require wealth to express itself. Take care of each other and remember that you always have a home here if circumstances require your return." The promise felt both comforting and hollow, given his condition and the farm's precarious financial situation, but the sentiment behind it provided emotional anchor that would prove crucial during the challenges ahead. Mrs. Fletcher met them at the Kansas City train station with the efficiency of someone who had managed similar arrangements many times before. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with silver hair arranged in a practical bun and clothing that suggested prosperity without ostentation. Her manner was businesslike but not unkind, and she immediately took charge of their luggage and travel documents with competent authority. "The Morrison brothers are well regarded throughout the Nebraska Panhandle," she informed them as they settled into their compartment on the westbound train. "Samuel has built one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory, and Daniel has a reputation for fairness in his business dealings. You should consider yourselves fortunate to have attracted the attention of such eligible men." As the train pulled away from Kansas City, carrying them toward an uncertain future, Rebecca and Ruth pressed their faces to the window for a final glimpse of Missouri countryside that had defined their entire existence. The familiar landscape gradually gave way to endless plains that stretched toward horizons they had never imagined, emphasizing the magnitude of the journey they were undertaking. The 3-day train journey provided an opportunity to observe Mrs. Fletcher more carefully. and both sisters gradually became aware of subtle inconsistencies in her behavior and conversation. While she spoke knowledgeably about the Morrison brothers and their ranch, her descriptions seemed rehearsed rather than based on personal acquaintance. When pressed for specific details about daily life at the ranch or the personalities of their future husbands, her answers became vague and general. More troubling were the periodic private conversations Mrs. Fletcher conducted with various men who approached their compartment at station stops along the route. These exchanges were brief and appeared casual, but Rebecca noticed that their chaperone seemed to be providing regular reports about their progress rather than simply engaging in friendly conversation with fellow travelers. Ruth, whose intuition about people had always been particularly acute, began to express private concerns about their situation during the second night of travel. While Mrs. Fletcher was visiting the dining car, she voiced suspicions that had been building since their departure from Kansas City. "Something doesn't feel right about this arrangement," Ruth whispered, mindful of the thin walls that provided minimal privacy in the train compartment. "Mrs. Fletcher knows less about the Morrison brothers than our correspondence," suggested she. "Would, and those men she's been talking to don't look like casual acquaintances." Rebecca had noticed the same discrepancies, but had been reluctant to voice her concerns, hoping that her growing unease was simply the result of nervousness about their unprecedented journey. Ruth's observations confirmed her own instincts and suggested that their situation might be more complex than they had been led to believe. The landscape outside their window had transformed into the vast emptiness of the Nebraska plains, where isolated ranch buildings appeared like islands in an ocean of grass. The sheer scale of the territory was both magnificent and intimidating, emphasizing their complete dependence on the Morrison brothers for everything from shelter to transportation. As their train approached North Platte, where they would transfer to the connecting transportation that would take them to the Morrison Ranch, both sisters felt a mixture of anticipation and dread that seemed to intensify with each passing mile. They had committed themselves to this course of action, but the mounting evidence that their circumstances might not be exactly what they had expected created a sense of foreboding that neither could entirely dismiss. The final revelation came during their last evening on the train, when Rebecca overheard a conversation between Mrs. Fletcher and a rough-looking man who had boarded at the previous station. The exchange was conducted in low voices, but Rebecca caught enough fragments to understand that their arrival was being coordinated with precision that suggested purposes beyond simple matrimonial arrangements. References to the cargo, delivery, schedules, and maintaining the cover story made it clear that the Hamilton twins were pawns in some larger scheme rather than the primary beneficiaries of generous ranchers seeking companionship. The realization that they had been deceived about the fundamental nature of their situation was both terrifying and clarifying, providing explanation for the inconsistencies they had noticed throughout their journey. As the train whistle announced their approach to North Platte, Rebecca and Ruth faced a critical decision with limited information and fewer options. They could confront Mrs. Fletcher about what they had discovered, risking immediate consequences they couldn't predict. They could attempt to abandon the journey and return to Missouri, although they lacked the resources for independent travel and had no guarantee that such an escape would be permitted. Or they could continue with the original plan while remaining alert for opportunities to understand and potentially influence whatever circumstances awaited them at the Morrison Ranch. The choice they made would determine not only their immediate safety, but their long-term survival in a situation that was rapidly revealing itself to be far more dangerous than they had imagined. The train began to slow as North Platte appeared on the horizon, and both sisters understood that their old lives were ending whether they were ready or not. The question now was what kind of new lives they would be able to create from the deception and uncertainty that surrounded them. The wagon that met them at North Platte Station bore little resemblance to the comfortable transportation the sisters had been promised in their correspondence. Instead of the elegant carriage they had envisioned, they found themselves facing a utilitarian freight wagon driven by a man whose appearance suggested he was more familiar with hard labor than customer service. Jake Morrison introduced himself as a cousin of the brothers, tasked with collecting their new arrivals and transporting them to the ranch. He was a lean, weathered man in his 40s, with the kind of calculating eyes that seemed to assess everything in terms of potential profit or threat. His greeting was polite, but perfunctory, lacking the warmth they might have expected from a family member welcoming new brides. The wagon bed had been fitted with rough wooden benches and a canvas cover that provided minimal protection from the wind that swept across the Nebraska plains with relentless intensity. As they loaded their belongings, Rebecca noticed that their luggage was being arranged with the same casual efficiency used for commercial cargo rather than the personal possessions of honored guests. Mrs. Fletcher's departure was abrupt and businesslike. She handed over several sealed envelopes to Jake Morrison, exchanged a few words in voices too low for the sisters to overhear, and disappeared into the crowd at the train station without any formal farewell. Her sudden absence left Rebecca and Ruth feeling more isolated and vulnerable than they had since leaving Missouri. The 50-mile journey to the Morrison Ranch took them through landscape that was both magnificent and monotonous. Rolling grasslands stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by occasional creek beds marked by lines of cottonwood trees and the distant silhouettes of isolated buildings that seemed dwarfed by the immensity of the sky. Jake Morrison proved to be a taciturn traveling companion, responding to their attempts at conversation with grunts or single-syllable answers that discouraged further interaction. When Ruth asked about the ranch's cattle operation, he replied that they would learn everything they needed to know once they arrived. When Rebecca inquired about the brothers' personalities and interests, he suggested they save their questions for the men themselves. The wagon's rough suspension and the rutted condition of the trail made for an uncomfortable journey that seemed to last far longer than the actual travel time. Both sisters found themselves bouncing and jolting with every bump and pothole, while the constant wind whipped through the canvas cover and filled their mouths with gritty dust that made breathing difficult. As the afternoon wore on and the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Rebecca and Ruth became increasingly aware of their complete isolation. They had not seen another human being or dwelling for hours, and the vastness of the surrounding landscape emphasized their total dependence on people whose true intentions remained unclear. The Morrison Ranch, when it finally appeared in the distance, was larger and more complex than either sister had anticipated. What they had imagined as a simple cattle operation revealed itself to be an extensive compound of buildings arranged around a central courtyard, with corrals, barns, and outbuildings that suggested diverse activities beyond basic ranching. The main house was an impressive two-story structure built of local stone and timber, with wide porches and tall windows that spoke of prosperity and attention to comfort. But the overall layout of the compound reminded Rebecca more of a military installation than a family ranch, with clear sightlines between buildings and strategic positioning that would facilitate defense against external threats. As their wagon approached the main gate, several men emerged from various buildings to observe their arrival. These were not the typical ranch hands Rebecca had expected to see, but rather individuals whose bearing and equipment suggested they were more accustomed to violence than cattle herding. Most carried firearms openly, and their expressions held the wary alertness of people who lived in constant expectation of trouble. Samuel Morrison himself came out to greet them, and his physical presence was even more imposing than his photograph had suggested. He was a tall, powerfully built man with the kind of natural authority that commanded immediate attention, and his welcome was courteous but contained an undercurrent of assessment that made both sisters feel like livestock being evaluated for. "A purchase, Miss Rebecca, Miss Ruth," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of formal courtesy. "Welcome to Morrison Ranch. I trust your journey was comfortable." His voice carried the educated accent of someone who had received proper schooling, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was playing a role rather than expressing genuine sentiment. Daniel Morrison appeared a moment later, and the contrast between the brothers was immediately apparent. Where Samuel projected confidence and control, Daniel seemed nervous and uncomfortable, as if he were participating in arrangements that made him uneasy. His greeting was warmer but less assured, and Rebecca noticed that he avoided making direct eye contact with either sister. The tour of the main house that followed was both impressive and unsettling. The interior was furnished with obvious expense and attention to comfort, featuring imported furniture, fine carpets, and artwork that suggested sophisticated tastes and substantial financial resources. Yet something about the atmosphere felt artificial, as if the domestic comforts had been arranged for display rather than actual use. Their assigned rooms were located on the second floor, with Rebecca's quarters adjacent to Samuel's master bedroom and Ruth's room positioned near Daniel's chambers. The proximity was explained as a convenience that would facilitate their adjustment to married life. But both sisters recognized the arrangement as a means of ensuring they could be monitored and controlled. The evening meal provided their first opportunity to observe the brothers in a social setting, and the experience was both revealing and disturbing. Samuel dominated the conversation with stories about his business successes and territorial politics, while Daniel contributed little beyond occasional nods of agreement. The dinner itself was elaborately prepared and served by Mexican workers, who moved through the dining room with the silent efficiency of people accustomed to avoiding notice. What struck Rebecca as particularly odd was the complete absence of discussion about wedding plans or arrangements. She had expected their first evening to include conversations about ceremony dates, guest lists, and the practical details of organizing two simultaneous marriages. Instead, the brothers seemed content to treat their arrival as the completion of a business transaction rather than the beginning of romantic relationships. After dinner, Samuel announced that the formal wedding ceremonies would be postponed indefinitely due to what he described as territorial complications that required his immediate attention. In the meantime, Rebecca and Ruth would be considered members of the household, with full access to the ranch's amenities and the expectation that they would assist with domestic management. The explanation was delivered with the kind of finality that discouraged questions, but Rebecca noticed Daniel's reaction to his brother's announcement. The younger Morrison brother appeared genuinely surprised by the postponement, suggesting that the delay had not been part of their original planning. Later that evening, as the sisters prepared for their first night in their new quarters, they had their first opportunity to discuss their observations and concerns in private. Both had noticed the same troubling elements: the military-like organization of the ranch, the obvious tension between the brothers, and the absence of normal matrimonial preparations. "This isn't what we were promised," Ruth whispered, mindful of the thin walls and the possibility that their conversations might be overheard. "Samuel is treating us like employees rather than future wives, and Daniel seems as confused about the arrangements as we are." Rebecca had reached similar conclusions, but was wrestling with the practical implications of their situation. They were hundreds of miles from home, completely dependent on the Morrison brothers for transportation and shelter, and in possession of information that suggested their circumstances were far more complex than simple marriage arrangements. The discovery that would change everything came by accident when Rebecca mistakenly entered the wrong room while looking for additional blankets. Instead of the linen closet she had been seeking, she found herself in what appeared to be Samuel Morrison's private office, furnished with filing cabinets, maps, and correspondence that revealed the true nature of the ranch's operations. Documents scattered across the desk told a story that had nothing to do with cattle ranching and everything to do with land fraud, territorial disputes, and what appeared to be systematic theft of government property. Maps showed railroad survey routes and mineral deposits. Correspondence discussed bribes paid to territorial officials, and financial records documented profits from activities that were clearly illegal. Most shocking of all was a contract bearing Daniel Morrison's signature that revealed he was not actually Samuel's brother, but rather a junior partner in a criminal enterprise that used the ranch as headquarters for operations spanning 3 states. The marriage arrangements had been designed to provide cover for the movement of stolen goods and to create alibis for the principals during periods when their activities might attract official attention. Rebecca's discovery was interrupted by footsteps in the hallway, forcing her to quickly leave the office and return to her own room. But she had seen enough to understand that she and Ruth were not prospective brides, but rather unwitting accomplices in a complex criminal scheme that could result in their imprisonment or worse if discovered by territorial authorities. The knowledge that only one of the marriage contracts was genuine and that both twins had been brought to Nebraska under false pretenses created a crisis that required immediate action. They could not simply flee into the vast wilderness surrounding the ranch, but remaining meant becoming increasingly complicit in activities that would ultimately destroy them. As Rebecca lay awake in her bed, listening to the sounds of men moving through the compound in the darkness beyond her window, she realized that survival would require them to become players in the dangerous game the Morrison brothers were orchestrating rather than passive victims of their deception. The challenge now was determining which brother represented the greater, a threat, which one might be manipulated into providing assistance, and whether there was any possibility of escaping the web of lies and criminality that had entrapped them in the Nebraska wilderness. The morning after Rebecca's discovery brought an unexpected development that would force both sisters to confront the full scope of their predicament. Daniel Morrison appeared at breakfast with obvious signs of distress, dark circles under his eyes, nervous gestures, and a demeanor that suggested he had spent a sleepless night wrestling with his conscience. Unlike the previous evening's carefully orchestrated dinner, this meal was attended only by the immediate household, creating an atmosphere of intimacy that allowed for more genuine conversation. Samuel was absent, having departed before dawn on what he described to the staff as urgent business in Cheyenne, leaving Daniel to manage the ranch and their guests. "I need to speak with you both privately," Daniel said after the Mexican servants had cleared the breakfast dishes and withdrawn to the kitchen. His voice carried an urgency that immediately captured the sisters' attention, and Rebecca felt her pulse quicken as she wondered whether her midnight exploration had been discovered. They moved to the front parlor, where tall windows provided natural light and a clear view of the compound's central courtyard. Daniel positioned himself where he could monitor the comings and goings of the ranch hands, while ensuring their conversation would not be overheard by casual eavesdroppers. "What I'm about to tell you will sound incredible," Daniel began, his hands trembling slightly as he struggled to find the right words. "But I can't continue this charade, knowing what Samuel has planned for you both." The confession that followed revealed layers of deception that exceeded even Rebecca's darkest suspicions. Daniel Morrison was indeed not Samuel's brother, but rather David Fletcher, a former territorial administrator who had been coerced into participating in the criminal enterprise after Samuel discovered evidence of embezzlement from his previous position. The mail-order bride scheme had been Samuel's innovation, designed to provide legitimate cover for money laundering operations while creating hostages who could be used to ensure the cooperation of territorial officials. Previous brides had been sold to buyers in Mexico after serving their purpose as window dressing for the ranch's supposed respectability. "Rebecca, you were supposed to marry me in a ceremony that would be legally binding," Daniel explained, his voice breaking with emotion. But Ruth's contract was always fraudulent. Samuel planned to use her for other purposes once the initial deception was complete. The revelation that only one marriage contract was genuine hit Ruth like a physical blow. She had been brought to Nebraska under completely false pretenses, intended from the beginning to be merchandise in whatever human trafficking operation Samuel Morrison was conducting through his network of criminal contacts. Daniel's confession continued with details that painted an even darker picture of their circumstances. The ranch served as a way station for stolen cattle being moved between territories, a storage facility for government property taken during staged Indian raids, and a recruitment center for men willing to participate in armed resistance against federal authorities attempting to establish law and order in the region. The territorial governor has been pressuring Samuel to relocate his operations, Daniel explained. Federal marshals have been asking questions about the ranch's activities, and there are rumors that military units will be deployed to investigate the recent increase in cattle theft and violence against surveying crews. This intelligence explained Samuel's sudden departure and his obvious anxiety about maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. The presence of two respectable young women would help deflect official suspicion while providing valuable hostages if negotiations with territorial authorities became necessary. Rebecca listened to these revelations with growing horror, but also with the calculating mindset of someone who understood that survival would require strategic thinking rather than emotional reactions. The information Daniel was providing represented both a warning and an opportunity if they could find ways to use his obvious guilt and fear to their advantage. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked, studying Daniel's face for signs of deception or manipulation. "What do you gain by betraying Samuel's confidence?" Daniel's response revealed a complexity to his character that neither sister had suspected during their brief acquaintance. He had been a legitimate territorial administrator before Samuel's blackmail had forced him into criminal participation, and his conscience had been increasingly troubled by the escalating violence and exploitation that characterized the operation. "I never intended for innocent people to be hurt," he said, his voice heavy with regret. When Samuel first proposed the mail-order bride scheme, he claimed it would simply provide cover without actually harming anyone. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because it offered a way to participate without becoming a complete monster. The discovery that Ruth was intended for human trafficking rather than marriage had apparently been the final straw that motivated Daniel's confession. Whatever crimes he had committed, whatever compromises he had made with his principles, he retained enough humanity to be horrified by the prospect of innocent women suffering for his cowardice. Ruth, who had been listening to this conversation with increasing agitation, finally found her voice. "What exactly did Samuel plan to do with me?" she demanded, her tone carrying steel that surprised both Rebecca and Daniel. The answer was even worse than they had feared. Samuel maintained connections with buyers throughout Mexico and the southwestern territories who were willing to pay premium prices for young white women who could be trained for various forms of forced labor. Ruth would have been transported south within weeks of her arrival, sold to buyers who specialized in breaking the will of educated women and converting them into compliant property. The legal marriage between Rebecca and myself would have provided perfect cover for these transactions, Daniel explained. Who would question the disappearance of a single woman when her twin sister was obviously thriving as the wife of a respectable rancher? Rebecca felt a cold rage building in her chest as she contemplated the casual cruelty of Samuel's planning. They had been manipulated from the moment of first contact, their desperate circumstances exploited by people who saw human suffering as a business opportunity rather than a moral crisis. But she also recognized that Daniel's confession provided them with leverage they could use to improve their situation. His obvious guilt and fear of Samuel's reactions suggested that he might be willing to assist them if they could convince him that cooperation offered better prospects than continued participation in Samuel's schemes. What happens when Samuel returns? Rebecca asked, her mind already working through various scenarios and possibilities. Will he expect the marriage ceremony to proceed immediately? Daniel's response revealed the time pressure they were facing. Samuel had scheduled a meeting with Mexican buyers for the following week, with Ruth's delivery planned to coincide with the transfer of a large shipment of stolen cattle. The marriage ceremony between Rebecca and Daniel was supposed to take place simultaneously, providing a festive atmosphere that would distract attention from the more sinister transactions. We have perhaps 5 days before Samuel returns with the buyers, Daniel said. After that, any opportunity to change the course of events will disappear. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Morrison, whose appearance in the parlor doorway suggested he had been monitoring their discussion. His expression was unreadable, but his positioning blocked their exit route, and his hand rested casually on the grip of his holstered pistol. Samuel asked me to keep an eye on things while he was away, Jake said, his tone deceptively casual. He was particularly concerned about making sure our guests didn't become confused about their circumstances or start entertaining unrealistic ideas about their options. The implied threat was clear, and Daniel's immediate reaction confirmed Rebecca's suspicions about the power dynamics within the criminal organization. Despite his supposed partnership with Samuel, Daniel was obviously subordinate to even peripheral figures like Jake Morrison when it came to operational decisions. We were just discussing wedding arrangements, Daniel replied, but his voice lacked conviction, and his nervous glances toward Jake suggested he was terrified of being discovered in unauthorized communication with the sisters. Jake's response made it clear that he was not fooled by the pretense. Samuel left specific instructions about communication protocols, he said, moving further into the room in a way that emphasized his control over the situation. All conversations with our guests are supposed to be monitored to ensure there are no misunderstandings about their status or future arrangements. The revelation that their interactions were being supervised added another layer of complexity to their already dangerous situation. Rebecca realized that any plans they developed would have to account for constant surveillance and the possibility that their movements and conversations were being reported to Samuel. But she also noticed that Jake's attention was focused primarily on Daniel, suggesting that the criminal organization's leadership was more concerned about preventing defection from within their ranks than about managing two supposedly helpless women. This oversight might provide opportunities for action that a more careful assessment would have eliminated. As Jake escorted Daniel away for what he described as ranch business that required immediate attention, Rebecca and Ruth found themselves alone for the first time since their arrival. The conversation they had just witnessed had provided crucial intelligence about their circumstances, but it had also revealed the narrow window of opportunity available for taking control of their situation. "We need to escape before Samuel returns," Ruth said, voicing the obvious conclusion that both sisters had reached. But we also need to find a way to ensure that Daniel's cooperation won't be discovered and punished. Rebecca was thinking along similar lines, but her analysis of their options was complicated by practical considerations that made simple flight impossible. They were hundreds of miles from civilization, had no transportation, and possessed no resources that would sustain them during an overland journey through hostile territory. More importantly, they had learned enough about Samuel Morrison's criminal network to understand that running away would only delay their recapture, while ensuring that their eventual punishment would be far worse than their current circumstances. If they were going to act, they needed to do more than simply escape. They needed to find a way to destroy the entire operation that had entrapped them. The plan that began to form in Rebecca's mind was audacious and dangerous, requiring them to become active participants in the very criminal enterprise they were trying to escape. But it offered the possibility of not just survival, but of turning the Morrison organization's own methods against its leadership in ways that might provide justice for all the victims who had suffered at Samuel's hands. The opportunity Rebecca had been waiting for came that afternoon when Jake Morrison departed the ranch with a crew of men to handle what he described as urgent business at a remote line camp. His absence created the first significant gap in the surveillance that had monitored their every move since arriving at the compound. Daniel appeared at their door within minutes of Jake's departure, his face pale with anxiety and his manner suggesting that he had been waiting desperately for this chance to speak freely. The conversation that followed would transform Rebecca and Ruth from passive victims into active architects of their own salvation. "I've been thinking about what we discussed this morning," Daniel began, glancing nervously toward the windows as if expecting Jake to materialize at any moment. "There might be a way to prevent what Samuel has planned, but it would require you to trust me completely." Rebecca studied his expression carefully, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. The intelligence she had gathered about the ranch's operation suggested that trust was a luxury they could not afford. Yet their circumstances left them with few alternatives to cooperation with the one person who seemed genuinely motivated to help them. "What did you have in mind?" she asked, her tone carefully neutral, despite the urgency she felt about their deteriorating situation. Daniel's proposal was both simpler and more dangerous than she had anticipated. He possessed detailed knowledge of Samuel's financial operations, including the location of several cache sites where stolen goods and money were stored throughout the territory. More importantly, he had access to correspondence that documented payoffs to territorial officials and evidence of federal property theft that could bring down the entire criminal network. If we could get this evidence to the territorial authorities before Samuel returns, it would trigger investigations that would destroy his operation, Daniel explained. But we would need to reach Cheyenne without being detected, and we would have to convince officials to act quickly, despite their previous reluctance to challenge Samuel's influence. The plan offered genuine hope for resolution, but Rebecca immediately identified several critical flaws that could prove fatal. The journey to Cheyenne would take at least 2 days by horseback, assuming they could obtain transportation without alerting the ranch hands who reported to Jake Morrison. More problematically, they had no guarantee that territorial authorities would act on their information, rather than simply alerting Samuel to their betrayal. "Samuel has been paying territorial officials for years," Ruth observed, voicing concerns that paralleled Rebecca's analysis. "What makes you think they would suddenly turn against someone who has been such a valuable source of income?" Daniel's response revealed a crucial piece of intelligence that changed the entire strategic landscape. Recent pressure from federal authorities had made Samuel's territorial contacts increasingly nervous about their association with his criminal activities. Several officials had already begun distancing themselves from the operation, and at least one federal marshal had been making inquiries that suggested a comprehensive investigation was already underway. The territorial governor is facing pressure from Washington to clean up the region before statehood proceedings begin, Daniel explained. Samuel's activities have become a political liability that officials can no longer afford to ignore. They would welcome an opportunity to arrest him that didn't implicate them in his previous crimes. This information transformed Rebecca's assessment of their options and suggested that a carefully orchestrated betrayal of Samuel's operation might indeed succeed. But she was beginning to formulate an even more ambitious plan that would not only ensure their escape, but also provide them with the resources needed to build new lives far from the reach of Samuel's remaining associates. "What if we didn't just expose Samuel's operation?" she said slowly, her mind working through the complex logistics of what she was contemplating. "What if we took control of it?" The suggestion struck both Daniel and Ruth as so audacious that they initially assumed she was speaking hypothetically. But as Rebecca continued to outline her thinking, they began to understand that she was proposing a genuine coup that would replace Samuel's leadership with their own direction of the criminal enterprise. Samuel's strength comes from his network of contacts and his reputation for ruthlessness, Rebecca explained, but those same assets could be turned against him if we could convince his associates that he had become a liability rather than an asset. The plan she described was intricate and dangerous, requiring them to manipulate the very people who currently held them prisoner, while simultaneously gathering evidence that could destroy the operation if their coup attempt failed. But it offered possibilities that simple escape could never provide: genuine financial security, the power to protect future victims, and the satisfaction of using Samuel's own methods to ensure his downfall. Daniel's reaction to the proposal revealed both his desperation and his continued underestimation of the sisters' capabilities. He was clearly attracted to any plan that offered hope of escaping Samuel's control, but he struggled to comprehend how two young women from Missouri could successfully manipulate experienced criminals and territorial politicians. Samuel's associates. "Respect, strength, and profit," he said doubtfully. "They're not going to accept leadership from people they see as helpless victims." Rebecca's response demonstrated that she had been carefully observing the ranch's operations and personnel during their brief time at the compound. She had identified key individuals whose loyalty to Samuel was based on practical considerations rather than personal attachment, and she believed several could be convinced to support new leadership if it offered better prospects for their own survival and prosperity. Jake Morrison is Samuel's enforcer, but he's also Samuel's potential replacement if something happens to the current leadership, she observed. His loyalty is based on self-interest, not sentiment. If we could convince him that Samuel's arrest was inevitable, and that cooperation with new management offered better prospects than loyalty to a doomed leader, he might be willing to facilitate a transition. The audacity of proposing to recruit Jake Morrison as an ally in overthrowing Samuel initially struck both Daniel and Ruth as evidence that Rebecca had lost touch with reality. But as she continued to explain her analysis of the ranch's power dynamics, they began to see the logic behind her seemingly impossible strategy. Samuel's recent nervousness about federal investigations suggested that his own associates were beginning to question his judgment and his ability to protect their interests. The arrival of Mexican buyers represented both an opportunity for profit and a dangerous exposure that could attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities. If Rebecca and Ruth could position themselves as offering a more cautious and sustainable approach to the criminal enterprise, they might be able to convince key personnel that a change in leadership was necessary for everyone's survival. The transition could be presented as a business decision rather than a personal betrayal, making it more palatable to people whose primary concern was their own prosperity. The first step in implementing this strategy would be approaching Jake Morrison during Samuel's absence and presenting him with evidence of the federal investigation that Daniel possessed. If they could convince Jake that Samuel's arrest was imminent, they could then offer him a partnership in a reformed operation that would avoid the most dangerous activities while maintaining profitable elements. We would need to have detailed plans for reorganizing the operation before approaching Jake, Rebecca explained. He needs to see that we're offering genuine leadership rather than simply trying to manipulate him into helping us escape. Over the next several hours, the three conspirators developed a comprehensive strategy for transforming Samuel Morrison's criminal enterprise into what Rebecca described as a legitimate frontier business with irregular elements. The plan involved abandoning human trafficking and government property theft while maintaining cattle trading operations that skirted legal boundaries without crossing them entirely. The reformed operation would focus on buying cattle from small ranchers who needed quick cash and selling them to buyers who didn't ask too many questions about documentation. This grey market approach would generate substantial profits while avoiding the federal attention that Samuel's more flagrant criminal activities had attracted. More importantly, the new leadership would establish relationships with territorial authorities based on information sharing rather than bribery. Jake Morrison's knowledge of criminal activities throughout the region could be valuable to officials who were under pressure to improve law enforcement without having the resources to conduct independent investigations. We would essentially become bounty hunters with our own ranch, Ruth observed, beginning to understand the elegance of Rebecca's strategy. We help territorial authorities capture other criminals while maintaining our own profitable operations within legal boundaries. The plan required them to move quickly while Samuel was away, using Daniel's access to incriminating documents and Jake Morrison's authority over the ranch hands to implement changes before the current leadership could return and re-establish control. The timing was critical, as they needed to present Jake with a fait accompli that made resistance more dangerous than cooperation. Daniel's role would be crucial during the initial phases, as his knowledge of the operation's financial structure and his access to Samuel's correspondence would provide the evidence needed to convince Jake that federal intervention was imminent. Once Jake agreed to support the transition, his authority over the ranch personnel would enable them to consolidate control before Samuel's return. The most dangerous moment would come when Samuel arrived with the Mexican buyers, expecting to complete transactions that the new leadership had no intention of honoring. Rebecca's plan called for using this confrontation to demonstrate to all observers that the old management had lost control and that new leadership offered better prospects for everyone's survival. Samuel will return expecting to find everything arranged according to his instructions, Rebecca said, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised both her companions. Instead, he'll find that his operation has evolved beyond his ability to control it. The choice he faces will be cooperation with new management or exposure to federal authorities who are already preparing warrants for his arrest. As evening approached and Jake Morrison's return became imminent, the three conspirators finalized their plans for the most audacious coup attempt in the history of frontier crime. They were no longer simply trying to escape Samuel Morrison's criminal enterprise. They were preparing to steal it from him while using his own methods to ensure their success. The transformation from victims to perpetrators represented a moral compromise that would have horrified their younger selves, but survival in the Nebraska wilderness required adaptations that civilized society would never understand or forgive. Tomorrow they would begin the process of discovering whether courage, intelligence, and desperation could overcome experience, ruthlessness, and superior firepower. Jake Morrison returned to the ranch as the sun was setting, his weathered face bearing the satisfied expression of a man who had completed unpleasant but necessary business. The crew that accompanied him dispersed quickly to their quarters, their movements suggesting they had encountered difficulties during their expedition to the line camp. Blood stains on several men's clothing indicated that whatever problems they had addressed had required violent solutions. Rebecca watched these arrivals from the second-floor window of her room, noting the way Jake's authority was acknowledged without question by men who clearly respected his competence in handling dangerous situations. This observation reinforced her assessment that recruiting him would be essential to their coup attempt, but it also emphasized the risks involved in approaching someone whose default response to problems appeared to involve lethal force. The evening meal provided their first opportunity to observe Jake in a domestic setting since learning about the ranch's true nature. Unlike Samuel's carefully orchestrated dinner performances, Jake's presence at the table was purely functional. He ate quickly and efficiently while discussing operational matters with Daniel in tones that suggested he considered the younger man a subordinate rather than a partner. "The situation at Red Creek has been resolved," Jake reported between bites of beef and potatoes. "We recovered the missing cattle and addressed the personnel issues that allowed the theft to occur. There shouldn't be any further problems from that direction." Daniel's response was carefully neutral, but Rebecca noticed his obvious discomfort with Jake's euphemistic language about resolving personnel issues. The implication that thieves had been killed, rather than arrested, provided additional evidence of the organization's willingness to use extreme measures to protect its interests. After dinner, as Daniel withdrew to his study and the household, staff completed their evening duties. Rebecca made the decision that would determine whether their coup attempt would succeed or result in their immediate execution. She approached Jake directly as he prepared to retire to his quarters, catching him in the compound's central courtyard, where their conversation would be visible to observers but not easily overheard. "Mr. Morrison," she said, using a tone of respectful formality that acknowledged his authority while requesting his attention. "Might I speak with you privately about a matter that concerns our mutual interests?" Jake's reaction was immediately suspicious, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon while his eyes scanned the surrounding area for signs of ambush or deception. Rebecca's approach represented a violation of the protocols that governed interaction between ranch personnel and their supposed guests, and his training had taught him to treat such anomalies as potential threats. "Miss Hamilton," he replied. "Carefully, I'm not sure what mutual interests you might be referring to. My understanding is that your concerns should be addressed through Daniel or Samuel, not through direct communication with operational personnel." Rebecca had anticipated this response and prepared her opening gambit accordingly. Instead of making immediate requests or proposals, she began by demonstrating knowledge that would establish her credibility, while making it clear that she possessed information about federal investigations that could affect everyone's future. "I'm referring to the activities of Federal Marshal Thomas Hendricks and his ongoing investigation into cattle theft and territorial corruption," she said quietly, watching Jake's expression for signs of recognition. "Daniel has shared certain documents with me that suggest this investigation poses immediate threats to everyone associated with this operation." The mention of Marshal Hendricks' name had the desired effect. Jake's casual demeanor disappeared, replaced by the focused alertness of someone who recognized a genuine threat to his survival. His knowledge of federal law enforcement activities was clearly extensive, and Rebecca's information had identified a specific danger that commanded his immediate attention. "What documents?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the hard edge that had been absent during dinner conversation. "And what makes you think this information concerns you?" Rebecca's response was carefully calculated to demonstrate both her understanding of the situation and her potential value as an ally, rather than simply another problem requiring elimination. She outlined her knowledge of the evidence Daniel possessed, while making it clear that she saw cooperation rather than confrontation as the optimal strategy for everyone involved. Samuel's correspondence with territorial officials provides a complete record of bribes, stolen property transactions, and planned criminal activities, she explained. Marshal Hendricks already has enough evidence to justify arrests, but he's waiting for additional intelligence that would allow him to dismantle the entire network simultaneously. Jake's expertise in criminal operations made him immediately aware of the implications of what Rebecca was describing. Federal marshals who possessed comprehensive evidence typically planned coordinated raids designed to capture all participants before anyone could escape or destroy incriminating materials. The timing of such operations was usually determined by opportunities to gather the maximum number of targets in a single location. "When is Samuel scheduled to return?" Jake asked, his question indicating that he understood the strategic situation Rebecca was outlining. 3 days, Rebecca replied, with Mexican buyers who will provide the federal authorities with evidence of human trafficking operations. Marshal Hendricks is probably waiting for that meeting to occur before initiating arrests that would include everyone present during the transactions. The conversation that followed demonstrated Jake Morrison's survival instincts and his ability to rapidly assess changing circumstances. Unlike Samuel, whose leadership was based on dominance and intimidation, Jake's authority derived from competence and practical intelligence that allowed him to recognize when situations required adaptation rather than confrontation. "What are you proposing?" he asked, after considering the implications of Rebecca's intelligence. "And what makes you think I would trust strangers over partners I've worked with for years?" Rebecca's answer revealed the comprehensive nature of the planning she had conducted with Daniel and Ruth. Rather than simply requesting Jake's assistance in escaping the ranch, she presented him with a detailed business proposal that would transform the criminal enterprise into a sustainable operation that could survive federal scrutiny while maintaining profitability. "We're proposing a transition to legitimate frontier trading that maintains profitable elements while eliminating activities that attract federal attention," she explained. "Cattle trading, information brokerage, and security services for ranchers who need protection from actual thieves. The same skills, the same personnel, but applied to ventures that work with territorial authorities rather than against them." Jake's initial reaction was skeptical, but Rebecca could see him evaluating the practical advantages of what she was describing. The federal pressure that threatened Samuel's operation would eventually affect all criminal activities in the territory, making legitimate alternatives increasingly attractive to people who valued their freedom more than maximum profits. "Samuel's methods have been successful for years," Jake observed. "Why should we assume that federal authorities will suddenly become effective at enforcing laws they've ignored for so long?" Rebecca's response drew on intelligence that Daniel had gathered about political changes in Washington that were affecting territorial governance. The approaching statehood process had made federal officials more attentive to criminal activities that might complicate Nebraska's admission to the Union, while railroad development had brought business interests that demanded more reliable law enforcement. "The territorial governor is under direct pressure from the Interior Department to resolve criminal problems before statehood proceedings continue," she explained. "Samuel's activities have become politically inconvenient for officials who previously tolerated them. Continuing the current operations guarantees federal intervention, while transitioning to legitimate business provides opportunities for accommodation with authorities who want to demonstrate progress without admitting their previous failures. The strategic conversation continued for over an hour, with Jake asking detailed questions about the proposed transition and Rebecca providing comprehensive answers that demonstrated her understanding of both criminal operations and territorial politics. Daniel's intelligence about federal investigations proved crucial in convincing Jake that immediate action was necessary to prevent catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. Ruth's appearance in the courtyard marked a prearranged signal that indicated other ranch personnel were beginning to take notice of their extended conversation. Her arrival also provided an opportunity to introduce the most audacious element of their proposal, the suggestion that Jake could maintain his current authority while serving new leadership that offered better prospects for long-term survival. "No, Sister and I aren't trying to escape this operation," Rebecca said as Ruth joined their conversation. "We're trying to save it from Samuel's poor judgment and federal prosecution. Your experience and leadership would be essential to making the transition successful." Jake's response to this proposition revealed both his pragmatic intelligence and his careful assessment of the sisters' capabilities. Rather than dismissing them as naive farm girls, he had been evaluating their strategic thinking and their potential value as business partners rather than simply obstacles to be managed or eliminated. "What guarantees do I have that you can deliver on these promises?" he asked. "And what prevents me from simply reporting this conversation to Samuel when he returns?" Rebecca's answer demonstrated the careful preparation that had gone into their approach. She and Ruth had anticipated Jake's skepticism and prepared evidence that would make cooperation more attractive than betrayal, while ensuring that reporting their conversation would implicate him in activities that Samuel would view as treasonous. "Daniel has already prepared documents that transfer operational authority to new management in the event of Samuel's arrest or disappearance," she explained. "Your signature on those documents would legitimize the transition while providing you with legal protection against charges related to previous criminal activities." The revelation that Daniel had been preparing legal documentation for the coup attempt clearly surprised Jake, but it also demonstrated the comprehensive nature of their planning. Rather than simply improvising responses to immediate threats, the conspirators had been developing a complete framework for assuming control of the operation. "You've thought this through more carefully than I expected," Jake admitted, his tone carrying a grudging respect for their strategic planning. "But implementing this transition would require more than just paperwork. Samuel's associates throughout the territory would need to be convinced that new leadership serves their interests better than loyalty to existing management." Rebecca's response revealed the final element of their strategy, a plan to use Samuel's meeting with Mexican buyers as an opportunity to demonstrate new leadership's competence, while exposing the former management's reckless judgment. The confrontation would serve as both a test of strength and a public declaration that the operation had evolved beyond Samuel's ability to control it. When Samuel arrives with buyers expecting to purchase human cargo, we'll be ready to demonstrate that this organization has more profitable and less dangerous business opportunities, she explained. His reaction to finding his plans thwarted will show everyone present whether he can adapt to changing circumstances or whether he's become a liability that threatens everyone's survival. As their conversation concluded and Jake withdrew to consider the proposition they had presented, Rebecca felt both satisfaction and apprehension about the commitments they had made. Their success in recruiting the ranch's operational leader represented a crucial victory, but it also meant they were now committed to a course of action that would either establish them as the new powers in territorial criminal enterprise or result in their violent elimination by forces they had underestimated. The morning after Jake Morrison's provisional agreement to support their coup brought a transformation in the ranch's operational dynamics that was both subtle and profound. While maintaining the appearance of normal routine, Jake began implementing changes that would position loyal personnel in strategic locations, while isolating potential Samuel loyalists from critical functions. Rebecca observed these modifications from her window as she watched Jake reassign guard duties, relocate weapons, caches, and conduct private conversations with key ranch hands. His expertise in managing criminal operations was evident in the efficiency with which he prepared the compound for the confrontation that would determine everyone's future. Daniel appeared at breakfast with documents that represented the legal framework for their assumption of control. Working through the night, he had prepared partnership agreements, operational guidelines, and correspondence with territorial authorities that would legitimize their activities while providing evidence of cooperation with law enforcement efforts. I've drafted letters to Marshal Hendricks offering information about criminal activities throughout the territory in exchange for immunity for personnel willing to assist federal investigations, Daniel explained as he spread the paperwork across the dining room table. Jake's signature on these documents would demonstrate good faith cooperation while providing legal protection for everyone involved in the transition. Ruth studied the correspondence with the careful attention of someone who understood that their lives depended on the accuracy and persuasiveness of these legal instruments. Her questions about specific clauses and contingencies revealed an intelligence that complemented Rebecca's strategic thinking and Daniel's operational knowledge. What happens if territorial authorities decide our offer isn't valuable enough to justify immunity agreements? Ruth asked, identifying a critical vulnerability in their planning. And how do we ensure that Marshal Hendricks doesn't simply arrest everyone regardless of their cooperation? Daniel's response demonstrated his understanding of territorial politics and federal law enforcement priorities. The pressure from Washington to resolve criminal problems before statehood meant that territorial officials were more interested in demonstrating progress than in prosecuting every individual involved in previous illegal activities. Federal marshals are evaluated based on their success in dismantling criminal organizations, not on the number of arrests they make, he explained. Hendricks would prefer to flip an entire operation rather than simply shut it down, especially if the reformed enterprise continues to provide intelligence about other criminal activities. The strategy session was interrupted by the arrival of a rider whose appearance suggested urgent news that would affect their carefully developed plans. The messenger was a young Mexican man whose exhausted horse and dusty clothing indicated he had traveled hard over considerable distance to reach the ranch. Jake Morrison emerged from the barn to receive the message, and his expression as he read the brief note confirmed that the information was both significant and troubling. The conversation that followed between Jake and the messenger was conducted in rapid Spanish that prevented the sisters from understanding its content, but the urgency of their exchange was unmistakable. "Samuel's plans have changed," Jake announced, after dismissing the messenger and gathering the conspirators in the ranch house parlor. "He's arriving tonight instead of tomorrow, and he's bringing more buyers than originally anticipated. Mexican authorities have apparently increased pressure on his southern contacts, forcing them to accelerate their operations." The news created both opportunities and dangers that required immediate adjustment of their strategy. Samuel's early arrival would give them less time to complete their preparations, but it would also provide less opportunity for him to detect the changes that had been implemented in his absence. More significantly, the presence of additional buyers would mean more witnesses to the confrontation that would establish new leadership, while potentially increasing the violence involved if Samuel chose to resist the transition. Jake's assessment of the tactical situation was characteristically direct and pragmatic. "We need to control the initial meeting between Samuel and the buyers," he said, studying the compound layout through the parlor windows. "If we can demonstrate our authority over the operation before he has a chance to re-establish control, the buyers will accept new leadership rather than risk their own safety in a power struggle." Rebecca's mind was already working through the logistics of staging such a demonstration. The key would be presenting Samuel with a fait accompli that made resistance more dangerous than cooperation, while ensuring that the Mexican buyers understood. They were witnessing a business transition rather than a hostile takeover. "Samuel will expect to find Ruth prepared for delivery and myself ready for the marriage ceremony," she observed. "Instead, he'll discover that we've assumed operational control and that his previous arrangements are no longer viable. His reaction will determine whether this transition occurs peacefully or violently." The afternoon was spent in intensive preparation for what everyone understood would be the most dangerous hours of the entire operation. Jake positioned his most reliable men at strategic points throughout the compound, while ensuring that potential Samuel loyalists were assigned duties that would keep them away from the central confrontation. Daniel reviewed his documentation one final time, making minor adjustments to language that would maximize their legal protection while ensuring that federal authorities would view their cooperation favorably. The correspondence with Marshal Hendricks was particularly crucial, as it would provide evidence of their intent to assist law enforcement efforts, rather than simply continuing criminal activities under new management. Ruth spent the afternoon preparing for her role in the evening's drama. Rather than presenting herself as a victim awaiting rescue, she would appear as an equal partner in the new leadership structure whose intelligence and determination had contributed to the successful transition. Her transformation from mail-order bride to criminal entrepreneur would shock Samuel, while demonstrating to the buyers that they were dealing with competent leadership. Rebecca's preparations were both practical and psychological. She needed to project the authority of someone who had earned the right to lead, while maintaining the composure necessary to negotiate with dangerous people under extreme pressure. The young woman who had left Missouri seeking marriage had evolved into someone capable of managing criminal enterprises and territorial politics. As evening approached and the sound of approaching horses announced Samuel's arrival, the conspirators took their predetermined positions for the confrontation that would either establish their control or result in their elimination. Rebecca stationed herself in the main parlor, where she would be immediately visible to Samuel upon his entry, while Ruth positioned herself nearby in a way that emphasized their partnership rather than her supposed victim status. Daniel took his place at the dining room table where his legal documents were prominently displayed, while Jake remained in the compound's central courtyard where he could monitor the movements of both arriving buyers and ranch personnel. The stage was set for a performance that would determine not only their individual fates, but the future of criminal operations throughout the Nebraska Territory. Samuel's entrance was as dramatic as Rebecca had anticipated. He burst through the front door with the confident energy of someone expecting to find his orders followed and his plans implemented, only to discover a situation that challenged every assumption he had made about power and control. "What the hell is going on here?" Samuel demanded as he took in the scene before him. Rebecca seated calmly in his favorite chair, Ruth standing beside her with obvious confidence, and Daniel surrounded by legal papers that suggested activities Samuel had not authorized. Rebecca's response was delivered with the composed authority of someone who had anticipated this moment and prepared accordingly. "Good evening, Samuel. We've been expecting you. I trust your journey was successful, although I'm afraid your business arrangements will need to be modified to accommodate new operational realities." The silence that followed was charged with tension as Samuel processed the implications of what he was witnessing. His psychological dominance of the operation had been based on the assumption that all personnel, from ranch hands to supposed brides, would remain subordinate to his authority, regardless of circumstances. "Where's Jake?" Samuel asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon as he began to understand that the situation was not simply a misunderstanding that could be resolved through intimidation. "Mr. Morrison is coordinating security arrangements for your meeting with the buyers," Rebecca replied smoothly. He felt it was important to ensure that everyone's safety was protected during what we anticipated might be a somewhat tense discussion. Samuel's expression shifted from confusion to anger as he realized that his operational lieutenant had apparently aligned with the supposed victims rather than maintaining loyalty to existing leadership. The betrayal represented more than a simple personnel problem. It suggested that his authority had been fundamentally undermined while he was absent. The sound of additional horses in the compound's courtyard indicated that the Mexican buyers had arrived, creating the time pressure that would force Samuel to choose between cooperation and confrontation without the luxury of extended consideration. His next words would determine whether the transition proceeded according to Rebecca's carefully orchestrated plan or erupted into violence that could destroy everyone present. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Samuel said, his voice carrying the cold menace of someone accustomed to resolving problems through elimination. "These buyers have very specific expectations, and they don't appreciate surprises or complications." Rebecca's response demonstrated the confidence that had carried her through every challenge since leaving Missouri. "Then I suggest we don't disappoint them. They're here to conduct business, and we're prepared to offer them opportunities that are both more profitable and less dangerous than your previous arrangements. The question is whether you're intelligent enough to recognize when circumstances have evolved beyond your ability to control them." The confrontation was about to reach its critical moment, with the arrival of the buyers providing the audience that would witness either Rebecca's triumph or her destruction. Everything they had planned and risked was now dependent on Samuel's reaction to the complete reversal of power that had occurred during his absence. The Mexican buyers entered the ranch house with the cautious confidence of men accustomed to conducting dangerous business in hostile territory. Their leader, introduced by Samuel as Don Carlos Mendoza, was an elegantly dressed man whose refined appearance could not disguise the deadly competence that had made him successful in human trafficking operations throughout the southwestern territories. Mendoza's immediate assessment of the situation in the parlor revealed an intelligence that made him far more dangerous than the crude criminals Rebecca had encountered during her time at the ranch. His dark eyes took in every detail: Rebecca's position of authority in Samuel's chair, Ruth's confident posture beside her sister, Daniel's legal documents spread across the table, and Samuel's obvious agitation about circumstances beyond his control. "Senor Morrison," Mendoza said in accented English, his tone carefully neutral despite the tension he clearly perceived. "I trust our business arrangements remain as discussed. My associates have traveled considerable distances based on your assurances about available merchandise." Samuel's response revealed the full extent of his predicament. He could not admit to the buyers that he had lost control of his operation without destroying his credibility and potentially his life, yet he could not deliver on promises about human cargo that was no longer under his authority. "There have been some complications," Samuel began, his voice betraying uncertainty that Mendoza immediately recognized as weakness. "Operational adjustments that require modification of our original agreements." Rebecca chose this moment to demonstrate the new power structure that had replaced Samuel's leadership. Rising from her chair with deliberate grace, she addressed Mendoza directly in fluent Spanish that shocked everyone present except Ruth, who had spent their afternoon preparing for exactly this demonstration. "Don Carlos," Rebecca said, her pronunciation carefully modulated to convey both respect and authority. "I am Rebecca Hamilton, the new operational director for this enterprise. I apologize for any confusion about today's arrangements, but we have more profitable opportunities to discuss than the transactions you planned with previous management." The revelation that one of Samuel's supposed mail-order brides spoke fluent Spanish and was claiming operational authority sent visible shockwaves through the room. Mendoza's bodyguards shifted positions slightly, their hands moving closer to concealed weapons as they tried to assess whether they were witnessing a business transition or an elaborate trap. Samuel's reaction was immediate and violent. "You've lost your mind if you think these Mexican bastards will negotiate with farm girls pretending to run operations they don't understand," he snarled, his hand moving toward his holstered pistol. "This ends now." The confrontation that erupted in the next few seconds would have resulted in multiple deaths if not for Jake Morrison's precise timing. As Samuel's weapon cleared its holster, Jake appeared in the parlor doorway with a rifle, aimed directly at his former employer's chest. "Samuel," Jake said quietly, his voice carrying the deadly calm of someone prepared to kill without hesitation, "I suggest you reconsider your options before making this situation worse for everyone involved." Mendoza's response to this standoff demonstrated the pragmatic intelligence that had made him successful in criminal enterprises, where survival required rapid adaptation to changing circumstances. Rather than choosing sides in the power struggle, he focused on determining which leadership offered better prospects for profitable business relationships. "It appears your organization is experiencing internal reorganization," Mendoza observed, his tone suggesting amusement rather than concern. "Perhaps we should postpone specific transactions until these administrative matters are resolved." Rebecca recognized this as the critical moment when she needed to demonstrate that the new leadership could provide value that exceeded Samuel's previous offerings. Her response would either establish her credibility with dangerous buyers or expose her as an amateur whose pretensions would result in violence. "Don Carlos, our reorganization offers opportunities that previous management could never provide," she said, moving to the dining room table where Daniel's documents were displayed. "We're prepared to offer you comprehensive intelligence about federal law enforcement activities throughout the territory, advance warning about raids and investigations, and introduction to territorial officials who can facilitate your operations." Rather than simply taking bribes to ignore them, the proposal she outlined was both audacious and strategically brilliant. Instead of simply selling human cargo in isolated transactions, the reformed operation would provide ongoing services that could protect Mendoza's entire network, while generating steady revenue streams rather than one-time payments. Territorial officials are under increasing pressure from Washington to demonstrate progress against criminal activities, Rebecca continued. But they're also practical men who understand that cooperation with selected enterprises can be more effective than futile attempts at comprehensive law enforcement. We can facilitate relationships that benefit everyone involved. Mendoza's interest was clearly engaged by this proposition, but his questions revealed the depth of analysis that made him a formidable business partner and an equally dangerous enemy. "What guarantees do you offer that these territorial officials will honor such arrangements? And what prevents federal authorities from simply arresting everyone involved, regardless of local accommodations?" Daniel stepped forward to address these concerns, his legal expertise providing credibility that reinforced Rebecca's strategic vision. "I have extensive correspondence with Marshal Hendricks documenting federal priorities and investigative methods," he explained, Federal authorities are more interested in dismantling large criminal networks than prosecuting individuals who provide valuable intelligence about regional activities. The conversation that followed demonstrated the transformation that had occurred in the ranch's power structure. While Samuel stood under Jake's rifle, effectively neutralized as a threat, Rebecca and Daniel conducted sophisticated negotiations with experienced criminals who gradually came to understand that they were dealing with competent leadership rather than naive amateurs. Ruth's contribution to these discussions revealed capabilities that none of the men had anticipated. Her questions about operational security, financial arrangements, and contingency planning demonstrated an understanding of criminal enterprise management that impressed even Mendoza's experienced lieutenants. Your previous management focused on short-term profits through high-risk activities, Ruth observed during a discussion about human trafficking operations. Our approach emphasizes sustainable revenue through services that complement rather than compete with federal law enforcement efforts. The strategic conversation continued for over an hour, with both sides evaluating the potential benefits and risks of establishing new business relationships. Mendoza's organization possessed resources and connections that could prove valuable to the reformed ranch operation, while the territorial intelligence and official contacts that Rebecca offered could provide protection and opportunities that traditional criminal enterprises could never access. Samuel's periodic attempts to interrupt these negotiations were met with Jake's unwavering attention and the clear message that further interference would result in immediate and permanent resolution. The former leader's gradual realization that his authority had been completely usurped was evident in his deteriorating composure and increasingly desperate threats. "You don't understand what you're dealing with," Samuel said during one of his interruptions. "These people will kill you the moment they decide you're more valuable dead than alive. This isn't some territorial political game. It's business conducted by people who solve problems through elimination." Rebecca's response demonstrated the confidence that had carried her through every challenge since leaving Missouri. "Samuel, your mistake is assuming that competence requires brutality and that intelligence is a sign of weakness. Don Carlos and his associates are businessmen who appreciate efficiency and reliability more than theatrical displays of violence." Mendoza's reaction to this exchange suggested that Rebecca's assessment was accurate. His nod of approval indicated that he preferred dealing with leadership that offered strategic thinking rather than simply threats and intimidation. The evening's negotiations concluded with preliminary agreements that would require additional discussion and documentation, but which established the framework for ongoing business relationships between Mendoza's organization and the ranch's new management. The Mexican buyers would return in 1 month with representatives from other criminal enterprises who might benefit from the territorial intelligence and official contacts that Rebecca's operation could provide. As Mendoza and his men prepared to depart, their leader offered Rebecca a final assessment that confirmed the success of her audacious strategy. "Señorita Hamilton, your proposal offers possibilities that traditional arrangements could never provide. We look forward to discovering whether your performance matches your promises." After the buyers had departed and the immediate crisis had passed, the conspirators found themselves facing the challenge of consolidating their control while managing Samuel's continued presence. Jake's rifle had prevented violence during the confrontation, but the former leader remained a dangerous threat, whose knowledge of the operation's previous activities could be used to undermine new management. "We need to decide what to do with Samuel," Jake observed, as they gathered in the parlor to assess their situation. "Killing him would eliminate the threat, but it would also create problems with his associates throughout the territory, who might view his death as evidence that we're unreliable partners." Rebecca's solution to this dilemma demonstrated the strategic thinking that had made their coup successful. Rather than eliminating Samuel, they would use his knowledge and connections while ensuring his continued cooperation through methods more sophisticated than simple intimidation. Samuel will become our advisor on previous operations and historical relationships, she announced. His expertise will be valuable in managing the transition, and his participation will demonstrate to territorial contacts that changes in leadership don't necessarily mean changes in business relationships. The evening that had begun with the potential for multiple deaths had concluded with the establishment of new criminal leadership that promised to be both more profitable and more sustainable than Samuel's crude operations. But Rebecca understood that their real challenges were just beginning, as they would need to prove their competence through successful performance rather than simply strategic planning. 6 months after the night that transformed two desperate farm girls into the most influential criminal leaders in the Nebraska Territory, Rebecca and Ruth Hamilton had built an enterprise that exceeded even their most ambitious dreams, while fundamentally changing the nature of frontier justice and territorial politics. The Morrison Ranch had evolved into something unprecedented. In the American West, a criminal organization that operated with the tacit approval and active cooperation of federal authorities. Marshal Thomas Hendricks had become a regular visitor to the ranch, not as an investigator pursuing lawbreakers, but as a collaborator who relied on the Hamilton sisters' intelligence network to identify and capture truly dangerous criminals. Throughout the region, the transformation had begun immediately after Mendoza's departure, when Rebecca implemented the business model she had outlined during their negotiations. Instead of competing with federal law enforcement, the reformed operation would supplement it by providing services that territorial authorities lacked the resources to perform independently. The ranch's new primary function was information brokerage. Rebecca and Ruth had developed an extensive network of contacts throughout the Nebraska Territory who provided intelligence about criminal activities, territorial disputes, and political developments that affected federal interests. This information was packaged and delivered to Marshal Hendricks in exchange for immunity agreements and official tolerance for activities that remained technically illegal but served larger law enforcement purposes. Daniel Fletcher, whose legal expertise had proven invaluable during the transition, had established himself as the territorial attorney who specialized in negotiating agreements between federal authorities and reformed criminal enterprises. His office in North Platte had become the unofficial headquarters for what territorial newspapers described as frontier justice partnerships that were achieving remarkable success in reducing regional violence. Jake Morrison remained the operational director of ranch activities, but his role had expanded to include training and deploying security personnel who protected legitimate businesses throughout the territory. Ranchers, mining operations, and railroad construction crews could hire Jake's men to provide protection against criminal activities that territorial authorities were unable to prevent through conventional law enforcement. The Mexican buyers who had witnessed the sisters' coup had become valuable business partners rather than simply customers. Mendoza's organization now served as an intelligence source about criminal activities originating south of the territorial border, while his connections with corrupt Mexican officials facilitated legitimate trade relationships that benefited American businesses seeking to expand their markets. Samuel Morrison's forced retirement from active leadership had been managed with the diplomatic skill that characterized all of the sisters' business relationships. Rather than eliminating him as a threat, they had convinced him to serve as an advisor whose knowledge of historical criminal relationships proved valuable in negotiating with territorial figures who might otherwise have resisted cooperation. With new management, Samuel's transformation from violent criminal leader to reluctant consultant had been accomplished through a combination of financial incentives and carefully applied pressure. He received a substantial monthly payment for his advisory services, but he also understood that any attempts to undermine the new leadership would result in immediate delivery to federal authorities who possessed comprehensive evidence of his previous crimes. The success of this approach had attracted attention throughout the frontier territories, where other criminal organizations began requesting assistance in transitioning to legitimate operations. Rebecca and Ruth found themselves consulting with territorial governors and federal administrators who wanted to replicate the Nebraska model in regions where conventional law enforcement had proven inadequate. The twins' personal lives had evolved. Along with their professional circumstances, Rebecca had eventually married Daniel Fletcher in a ceremony that was both a genuine expression of affection and a strategic alliance that strengthened their control over territorial legal affairs. Their relationship had developed from desperate cooperation into genuine partnership, built on shared experiences and mutual respect rather than romantic passion. Ruth had chosen a different path, establishing herself as an independent businesswoman who managed the ranch's financial operations while developing commercial relationships throughout the territory. Her reputation for shrewd negotiation and absolute reliability had made her one of the most sought-after business partners in Nebraska, with legitimate enterprises competing for her attention and investment. The wealth that flowed from their reformed criminal enterprise exceeded anything the sisters had imagined during their desperate days in Missouri. The ranch had been expanded and modernized, featuring amenities that rivaled the finest establishments in Denver or Chicago. But more importantly, their financial success had provided them with the security and independence that had always been their primary objectives. The correspondence they maintained with their father during his final months had provided emotional satisfaction that complemented their material achievements. The money they sent to Missouri had ensured that he received the best medical care available while maintaining the family farm as a symbol of their origins and a retreat they could return to if circumstances required. Their father's death the previous winter had been peaceful rather than agonizing, surrounded by medical professionals and comfort that their success had made possible. His final letters had expressed pride in their accomplishments while acknowledging that he did not fully understand the nature of the business that had transformed their lives so dramatically. The funeral had provided their first opportunity to return to Missouri since departing as mail-order brides, and the contrast between their current circumstances and their previous desperation had been both satisfying and sobering. The community that had watched them leave as impoverished farm girls struggling to survive now welcomed them as successful businesswomen whose achievements had brought honor to their family and their region. But the sisters understood that their success had come at moral costs that could never be completely reconciled with conventional standards of right and wrong. They had built their empire by manipulating criminal enterprises and territorial authorities, using methods that civilized society would condemn, even when applied for beneficial purposes. The human trafficking operation they had disrupted had been replaced by intelligence services that still involved exploitation of desperate people seeking better lives. The cattle theft that had funded Samuel's operation had been transformed into protection services that sometimes involved intimidation and violence against people who refused to pay for security they didn't want. Yet Rebecca and Ruth had also created opportunities for dozens of people who had been trapped in genuinely destructive criminal activities to transition to sustainable livelihoods that served legitimate purposes. Former cattle thieves had become security personnel protecting honest ranchers. Previous participants in government property theft had become intelligence sources, helping federal authorities identify and capture serious criminals. The moral complexity of their situation was further complicated by the undeniable benefits their operation provided to territorial development. Federal authorities privately acknowledged that the Hamilton Sisters network had contributed more to regional law enforcement than years of conventional investigation and prosecution efforts. Territorial governors credited their intelligence services with preventing several Indian wars that would have devastated both white settlements and tribal communities. Railroad executives praised their security services for enabling construction projects that would have been impossible without protection against criminal interference. The approaching statehood process had provided the sisters with their greatest opportunity and their most serious challenge. Federal authorities, evaluating Nebraska's readiness for admission to the Union, had identified the Hamilton network as evidence that territorial leadership was capable of innovative approaches to governance that could serve as models for other frontier regions. But statehood would also bring increased federal oversight and legal frameworks that might not accommodate the informal arrangements that had made their operation possible. The sisters were negotiating with congressional representatives about establishing official recognition for their activities while ensuring that increased scrutiny would not expose them to prosecution for their previous crimes. The solution they were developing involved creating a private security and intelligence company that would operate under federal contract while maintaining the flexibility necessary for frontier conditions. The proposal had attracted support from business interests and territorial officials who understood the practical benefits of their approach, but it faced opposition from federal administrators who preferred conventional law enforcement methods. As Rebecca stood on the ranch house porch on a clear autumn morning, watching crews of workers constructing additional buildings that would house their expanding operations, she reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them from desperate farm girls to territorial power brokers in less than 2 years. The mail-order bride deception that had initially trapped them in Samuel Morrison's criminal enterprise had ultimately provided them with opportunities they could never have accessed through conventional means. Their willingness to embrace moral complexity and strategic manipulation had enabled them to build something unprecedented in American frontier history. The young women who had left Missouri seeking marriage and financial security had discovered capabilities they never knew they possessed and created lives that exceeded their wildest dreams. But they had also learned that success in the frontier territories required compromises that would forever separate them from the innocence they had carried west on that train from Kansas City. Ruth joined her sister on the porch, carrying correspondence that included invitations to consult with territorial authorities in Colorado and Wyoming about replicating their Nebraska model. The sisters' reputation had spread throughout the frontier territories, creating opportunities for expansion that could make them the most influential women in the American West. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Ruth asked, her question encompassing both the immediate challenges of territorial expansion and the longer-term implications of the choices they had made. Rebecca's answer reflected the confidence that had carried them through every crisis since their departure from Missouri. "We've proven that survival requires more than just accepting whatever circumstances others create for us," she said. "Everything we've built started with the decision to take control of our own story rather than remaining victims of other people's plans." The morning sun painted the Nebraska plains in shades of gold and copper that reminded Rebecca of the autumn day when they had first received Samuel Morrison's letter. The desperate girls who had accepted that proposal, seeking escape from poverty, had evolved into women who created their own opportunities while helping others do the same. The empire they had built from deception and desperation would continue to evolve as territorial conditions changed and new challenges emerged. but the fundamental principle that had guided their transformation would remain constant. The belief that intelligent people could reshape their circumstances through strategic thinking and moral flexibility when conventional approaches proved inadequate. As another day began at the enterprise that bore their family name rather than Samuel Morrison's, Rebecca and Ruth Hamilton prepared to face whatever challenges their success might attract. They had learned that building an empire required constant vigilance and continuous adaptation, but they had also discovered that the freedom to control their own destiny was worth whatever sacrifices that control might demand. The mail-order bride deception that had brought them to Nebraska as potential victims had ultimately enabled them to become the most powerful women in the territory. Their story would be remembered not as a tale of innocent girls rescued from criminal enterprise, but as an example of how intelligence, courage, and strategic thinking could transform any circumstances into opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Years later, when historians studied the transformation of the American frontier from lawless territory to organized states, they would identify the Hamilton Network as a crucial innovation that demonstrated the possibility of cooperation between criminal enterprises and legitimate authorities. The sisters' approach would influence federal policy toward frontier territories for generations, proving that effective governance sometimes required embracing solutions that conventional wisdom would reject. But Rebecca and Ruth Hamilton would always remember their story as beginning with a simple decision. When faced with circumstances they could not accept, they chose to change those circumstances rather than accepting defeat. Everything that followed, the wealth, the power, the influence that shaped territorial development, had grown from that fundamental refusal to remain victims of other people's plans. The Nebraska plains stretched endlessly toward horizons that no longer represented limits but possibilities, and two women who had traveled west as mail-order brides prepared to face whatever adventures their empire might create. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.